What's up guys, Metal571 here, and today I'm going to be talking about the Audeze LCD-2 closed back. This is a review unit from Bloom Audio. You can visit them at bloomaudio.com. I want to thank Andrew for sending this over, and right afterwards it gets returned to the dealer. It's a 899 70 ohm 101 decibel per milliwatt 106 millimeter planar magnetic closed back full size headphone. You can say that one 10 times fast also. And let's get right into the sound. As always, we'll start with the bass first. It's the most neutral measuring part of the headphone, and it sounds like that to me. And I've said that so many times. I've been reviewing so many planers, and this is no exception here. There's no roll-off really at all toward the very bottom. Dynamics sound fine to me. I don't have any problems with that. I'm not really the best judge. I'm not gonna lie, of dynamics, but when they're really punchy, I'll get a sense of that, but I just don't really lack dynamics like a Mr. Speaker's headphone might either, or Dan Clark Audio. So they're decent. I don't really have any problems with that. I'm going to be talking about the ZMF Atticus in this review as well. It's kind of what my comparison point is. This is a headphone that I actually own and ordered for myself from ZMF. And for the Atticus, the bass actually can do sub bass, as if you noticed, it was wearing the Ori suede pads, which generally have a better seal overall, especially since I wear glasses. So it has more of a mid bass focus than the Audeze does, but the dynamics are not quite there. On the Atticus, they're decent, but they're not as capable as, for example, the Icon, because its biocellulose driver is quite a bit better. And I've reviewed those two back to back a while ago. And so I think the LCD-2 closed back here has it beat in bass slightly, because it's got slightly better dynamics and there's no mid-bass hump, so it just sounds pretty much right in the bass. And now let's talk about the mid-range, and this is where things start to get really odd. And I wrote this right in my notes here, it's all over the place with strange, unnatural colorations. It really is the biggest problem with the headphone sound. And the interesting thing about this headphone is when you first put it on and you listen to it, at least for me, I was like, what coloration? And then you start comparing it to things and it's like, oh boy, this sounds really strange. And so by strange, I mean there's a wide dip around 400 hertz of say 2 to 3 decibels. There's a shout at around 2K, about 2 decibels. It's still got that 4K dip that a lot of the LCD-2, LCD-3, LCD-4s have. But just like the LCD-2 Classic I reviewed, I don't think you want to EQ it up too much, because it doesn't seem to need as much EQ in terms of being boosted, or take EQ as well there. So I didn't boost that 4K region very much, but it is still a little recessed for my preference. And I've got an LCD-2 phaser up there. That's something I actually own, not this. So yeah, not the greatest. And the really unfortunate part with the mid-range tuning is that EQ can only sort of compensate, and I just find that the timbre of this headphone for instruments in the mid-range is really not that good. Unfortunately, the vocals don't sound right. They lack body because of that 400 hertz dip. The 2K peak makes things sound slightly shouty and off tuning in the upper mids. I tried to get it as good as I could with my EQ that you can find in the description for EqualizerAPO and Piece, but it just didn't quite get there. And that's very different, because the Atticus absolutely nails the mids. It's probably my favorite part about this headphone by far. The mid-range just sounds, I don't know how else to put it, it just sounds right. It actually doesn't sound as recessed as the Aeolus did, which I've since learned it's Aeolus, at least that's how Zach pronounces it. The Aeolus was a little bit less forward in the upper mid-range around ear resonance at 3.5K. This is not. This is pretty much on target when you get rid of the crazy treble, which I'll probably talk more about when I get to reviewing the Atticus itself. But yeah, the mid-range, back to the Audeze, the mid-range it's got some weird coloration. Low mid dip, 2K off color peak, and then 4K's got a little bit of a dip, and then you can try to EQ it, but it doesn't quite get there. My EQ is kind of loosely based on the Audeze Reveal EQ, which I tweaked a bit to sound as good as I could, but it just doesn't quite get there. And onto the treble, this is not bad. This is the region that is the closest to my personal target, just like the bass is. Similar to my own personal target as well. It's just got a little bit of a peak in the mid treble. Maybe not even a peak at all, depending on how treble sensitive you are. The detail is, of course, a downgrade from the LCD-2 Classic and the LCD-2 Phaser. I mean, it's a closed back, so it's going to trade some detail. It's normally what happens. The treble gets hazier, the mid-range and the bass kind of get a little messed up in tuning, but unfortunately the mid-range kind of suffers a little too much with this driver, I think, when you close it up. But the treble really wasn't affected that much. I was kind of surprised. Some of the resolution is, of course, and I was surprised how much resolution was maintained from closing up this headphone, but still, it's definitely a downgrade from LCD-2 Classic. If you're looking for exactly the same sound as the 2C or the 2F, you're not going to quite get that here. The frequency response was obviously affected, and of course the treble detail as well. And detail-wise, back and forth between this and the Atticus, they're sort of close in the treble. I think, again, the ZMF is slightly behind, actually. Just like in the bass, it was slightly behind in dynamics. In the treble, I think it's slightly behind in detail, believe it or not. When I compared it versus the LC2 closed. So another win there, sort of, for the Audeze, I guess. Now, it's also worth noting that the Atticus is wearing suedes again and again. The suede, the Ori suede pads here seem to be a little more detailed to me, at least, than the leather pads, which is interesting. I didn't expect that. And it's something to do probably with how they damp the treble. I'll get into more details of that when I review the Atticus from my own perspective. And so for back to the Audeze, I didn't really touch the EQ for the treble section, which is pretty good. And it's interesting because a lot of graphs for the LCD-2 closed show that there's supposed to be a peak around 6K, but I'm barely hearing that, honestly. It doesn't really sound off to me in the treble. So take that for what it is. And this is quite unlike the Atticus, which has got quite an aggressive treble, mid-treble, actually. It's funny that the Atticus is known as a very warm headphone, but that's really the mid-range relative to the mid-treble. It's got this really narrow spike at around 10 or 11K that I have to correct by about 5 decibels. It's pretty strong. So, yeah, Atticus treble, it's got the good soundstage and a good treble quality, but the tuning of the treble actually I prefer on the Audeze. So yeah, there's a lot of differences between these two headphones, not surprisingly. And speaking about more differences, and I just alluded to it, the soundstage on this actually beat my Atticus, and I was surprised because I thought the Atticus was one of the widest closed backs I've heard. The Atticus has by far the widest soundstage when it's wearing the Ori shaped pads, whether using suede or leather. On this one, this soundstage was slightly wider than the Atticus, which is really good. But the image is slightly more spread out. I think that center image is not quite as defined on the Audeze as on the Atticus. The Atticus might sound a little bit more natural in the soundstage, but it's just not quite as wide. So really, they're very close. Me, I'd personally pick the Audeze actually again in the stage. So other stuff that's not sound, deal breakers section. This is heavy, man. This is 630 grams. I measured this one in particular. And for some reason, I never had a problem with other Audezes and weight. Not even the LCD-4, except for really long periods of time. But this one really bugs me. And I don't know why, but my neck actually did start to get sore after wearing this for, an hour, 2 hours. I think I wore it on a stream, and after 2.5 hours, I was like, this is ridiculous. I definitely can't wear it any longer than that. And that's more of a problem for a closed back, because a closed back you might be wearing in a studio for hours and hours, and if you were trying to use this as a monitor, you can't. It's just too heavy. So that's kind of unfortunate. I don't know how they got from 550 grams to 630 by closing this up, but that's just the way it is. And so that's something that I have to knock on. And I don't usually knock Audezes for being heavy because I haven't noticed them, but I should knock them more because there are some people who are going to be very sensitive to this. So just be aware, this is pretty heavy. 630 grams is no joke. It's not as heavy as an LCD-4, but it's pretty heavy. And also the isolation is not amazing. It's When I close this up and I play music, the isolation's only kind of moderate, which I was surprised by because it looks so closed and doesn't look like it has any obvious venting. I don't know. Maybe it does and I'm missing it, but... And then it's got leather pads, I believe this is... Actually, this might be pleather because this is from the LCD-2 Classic, but I don't remember. I think it might be leather-free. Someone can correct me on what pads the closeback uses. But anyway, regardless, the isolation's only kind of moderate. And I was surprised because even though the Atticus is vented, as you can clearly see, it's really closed. And even with the suedes, which are, thick suedes, so they do isolate. It isolates better, I think, playing about the same volume. So that's something to keep in mind. So even though they're trying to close this off, I wouldn't blast it next to your coworker. But other than that, no real other complaints. Build quality is as solid as always. I think this is probably using the same crystal-infused nylon rings, but you can confirm that from their website pretty easily, I think. So, what's the upshot here? This is basically what happened was I took this on my own, and then I watched Resolve Review's review. Wow, that's hard to say. And I pretty much came to the same conclusion as he did. The seemingly minor-ish frequency response flaws really come together to force the timbre of this headphone to just not sound that natural. And its instruments just sound weird, and they just don't sound right. And even with EQ, it doesn't quite get there. So, and I wrote this in my notes, mids are king. Don't mess them up such that even the timbre, when it's improper, persists through EQ. And that's what's happened here. And that's really unfortunate. But this is kind of a mixed verdict, because as you can see, if you can deal with the instruments sounding weird, like if you're listening to electronic music a lot, I can see people liking this, because the technicalities of this headphone actually do beat my Atticus in some ways. The soundstage is slightly wider, bass dynamics might be slightly better, no mid-bass hump on the Audeze, treble is slightly more detailed, which is interesting, because as you guys will know, I really have loved the Atticus for so long, and this made me change my mind about some of the aspects of the Atticus. So that's pretty interesting, but there's no denying that the timbre and the ZMF's way better, and the mids just sound right. Mids are just the most important part to get right on a headphone. Almost nobody does, and this is just weird. So that is how this sounds overall. So it's really kind of a mixed bag. But again, like the other upshot is like costing more than the LCD-2 Classic, weighing significantly more, and being closed. I really don't understand who this was aimed at, which is something that Resolve also said. It's so heavy that you can't wear it for long periods of time, which you would want to do because it's a closed back probably. And I don't know. I just don't understand why this was. I guess it was just one of those things that Audeze was like, if we can do it, we'll do it. And they did, but I think somebody probably should have asked, is it worth bothering? That sounds pretty savage, but hey, that's what I think, honestly. And the other thing is that thankfully, this is so much more neutral than the LCD-XC, which I've heard a couple of times. It just has such an aggressive 6K peak to it by comparison to the LCD-2 closed. And that just doesn't sound anywhere near normal. This actually has some semblance of sounding normal, but not quite there. However, Mobius, hilariously, nails the mid-range totally differently than this does. And I don't understand what's going on there. And Mobius obviously doesn't have the same bass capabilities. It's got a lot of bass extension, but it's also boosted in the sub bass. You can't really get rid of that. All the EQs have it. But the mid-range timbre and the mid-range tuning is just so much more bang-on correct than this thing. And that's weird. Although Soundstage again suffers. Anyway, I'm bringing too many comparisons in, but maybe that'll help you decide between Mobius and this. So that some of the technical aspects you can't fix with EQ here are better, but then the mid-range is just so weird. So what I'd like to see in the end, from just totally wiping away what's there in the market and replacing it, I would like to see a lightweight, full-size LCD closed back that's much lighter than the LCD-XC or this thing. And I'd also like to see an LCD-1 closed back, just like many of you guys said. It's sitting right there. So I have an LCD-1. That's still a review unit back there, and Audeze probably would have offered to let me keep it, but I told them it's going back. I'm buying my own. I already ordered it from Bloom Audio. And the Audeze Mobius I was talking about, I also ordered from Bloom Audio with my own money. K371, which I'm wearing, is a review unit. AKG offered to let me keep it. Also not doing that, sending it back to them after I do the K361 review and buying this with my own money. So just so you have an idea of where I stand on where all these products are. And once again, thanks to Bloom Audio, and this is going right back to them afterwards. And it's not mine. So that's what I think about the LCD-2 closed back. Hopefully that is helpful. Still a bizarre offering that, I don't know, it does some things really well and some of the most critical things not so well. So there you go, guys. Hope that's helpful, and I'll see you guys in the next review.